So even though there's only one track here today, there's only one option, I'm hoping that you're all here because you already know that accessibility is important, right? It's a thing we all know. Thank you. And thank you for being here at this talk at an event about designing for difference and for knowing that accessibility is important, because accessibility can feel kind of fraught or stressful sometimes, like you're about to say or do the wrong thing at any moment and be a huge jerk without trying to. And spoiler alert, you probably will. Most of us probably will. I will probably say at least 4 incorrect things during this presentation. And please, if you notice something, come up to me and let me know later. Because I like to think of that discomfort that we have with these topics that might feel a little foreign to us as the discomfort of examined privilege. The discomfort that comes from looking at the things that we don't necessarily have to deal with every day. And because we shouldn't have to be comfortable to engage with important ideas, with important topics, right? And we really increasingly don't have an option not to engage, because for many of us, depending on the projects we work on, accessibility is a regulatory or a compliance requirement. If we work on anything government, with large companies, often we have to make things accessible. Also, it's increasingly a huge legal liability. I wasn't able to find data for less litigious countries than the United States, but in 2017 alone, there were more than 700 lawsuits in the United States about inaccessible websites. And even if none of these go to trial, even if none of them end up with a cash settlement, it's terrible for public relations. And no company wants that in the news about them. So it's increasingly non-optional. I really have to do it. Also, making our sites and products accessible means opening them up to more customers. Since according to the World Health Organization, as was cited earlier in the video, 15% of people worldwide have some kind of a disability. One of the things that I think is really interesting about this is that this actually only counts certain kinds of disabilities. So this is really for permanent disabilities that are considered quite severe. So things like missing a limb or being permanently deaf or blind. It doesn't include the many, many more people who are experiencing a temporary disability, like having a broken arm and having it in a sling, so they can't use one of their limbs. Or what we call a situational disability, which is something like being a new parent and having a baby all the time so you can't open things with that hand. These are things that many, many more of us experience on a daily basis. And interestingly, about 60% of us will use some kind of assistive technology on our devices, oftentimes without realizing it. So if you've ever magnified something in a browser, if you've ever used closed captions because you were in a cafe, anything like that, you've used an assistive device without realizing it and benefited from it. So most of us will use these things at some point in our life. Occasionally, I hear people say that they can't justify doing extra work for such a small minority of people. It's only 15%. We can't do all this extra work for such a small number of people. And I think that's absolutely wild because we do extra work so frequently for other very small populations. For instance, everything I do has to work on Internet Explorer 6 through 8. Because we're Microsoft. And many other websites, this is true too. You know that you have some enterprise customers who use legacy browsers. You know that there's a regulatory requirement that you have to address these older browsers, so you have to design for them. I pulled the numbers, I went through our data, and only 0.02% of visitors to docs.microsoft.com use IE 6 through 8. If .microsoft.com is not literally in your URL, it is probably fewer for you. Like, this is an upper limit of the number of people who are using these old browsers most of the time. And whenever the engineers specifically that I work with push back on this and say, hey, this is so much more work, we can't do this for 0.02% of people, we hear, but it's still hundreds of thousands of people. That tiny percentage with our traffic is still so many. And I'm like, oh, all right, fair enough. Small percentage is still a lot of people. That 15% is starting to look better. especially because supporting legacy browsers increases development time by anywhere between 30 to 100%. So depending on what support means, because it can look like a lot of different things, and depending on what features you're using, it's either 30% more development time or it can double it. And that's a choice that the companies we work for make all the time. Many of us will support older browsers, even if they're not as difficult as IE6. So the numbers just don't add up to me, that we're privileging one of these groups over another. On top of all that, it's the right thing to do. At a very basic level, it is morally incorrect to exclude people from public life because of their abilities. And hopefully, we are all empathetic enough to know that and agree. Incidentally, Ann Gibson's An Alphabet of Accessibility talk, which I've linked here, and you guys can get all of this, is a great way to start building an understanding of what those access needs really are and what they look like. Because I think for many of us, when we think of accessibility, we kind of stop and end with screen readers. And we're like, ah, yes, accessibility, screen readers. We'll make that work. And screen readers are great. We should design for them, but it's not the whole picture. There's a lot more to do. As a note, you'll hear me talk about both accessibility, and then the talk is called Inclusive Design. And inclusive design might be a new term to a lot of us. It's something we talk about a lot at Microsoft, and it's the idea that it's a design methodology that focuses on recognizing when people are being excluded, designing for people with permanent disabilities as a way of improving experiences for everyone, and putting people with diverse needs and experiences at the center of the design process so we can learn from that diversity. When you design this way, the idea is that technical accessibility is one of the outcomes of the process, but it's not the exclusive point. We're also designing an experience that makes more sense and works better for everybody, that also happens to be technically accessible at the end of the process. And information architecture is actually a really key part of this that nobody talks about. So accessibility is important. The problem is, I am lucky enough to be a full-time information architect. That's my title, that's all I do. I haven't built a wireframe in 2 years. I don't have to pick colors, I don't code, I don't do anything with images. And so the discussions about accessibility really never included me. I've done a lot of interviews bringing developers in and that kind of thing, and I always ask them about coding accessibly, and they always have very good answers. And when they interviewed me, they didn't ask me. Everybody's kind of like, oh yes, that's for somebody else. And so it was very tempting and easy to think that accessibility was important, but it was important for other people. It was important for the developers and designers. The problem was, as soon as I started actually reading the standards and empirical studies of people with access needs, it became clear that I was letting myself off the hook. I was not taking responsibility. And I think maybe as a profession of information architects, we are all letting ourselves off the hook a little bit. And there's more we could take responsibility for, because I have some bad news. I also have some good news in a minute, but the bad news is that IA is often a huge accessibility problem. So for instance, it's a general maxim in information architecture that navigational structures, generally speaking, should be broad and shallow rather than deep and narrow. So you want to give more people more choices in fewer levels rather than just a few choices at a bunch of levels. And this is something that we have been doing studies on for, I think actually probably about 40 years. It's very well documented. It's in all of the kind of best practices. Great. In a recent study of people who use screen readers, researchers found that blind users take, generally speaking, about 2 to 4 times as long to accomplish any given task as sighted users do. So generally speaking, if you're using a screen reader, it takes longer to do anything. That's normal. And that could be better. It would be nice if it didn't take longer, but we're pretty used to that. And people who use screen readers are mostly pretty used to that. However, and then we know that when navigation is deep and narrow, it takes everybody longer to accomplish tasks. So whether you're sighted or not, it takes longer if the navigation is deep and narrow. Problem is, it's not equal. Deep and narrow navigation means that blind users now need nearly 8 times as long as sighted users do. That's a very long time, 8 times as long. But it also means that poorly constructed navigation, us not doing the things that we know we should do, is disproportionately hindering people who use screen readers. Another study from a few years ago focused on how people with dyslexia experience the web. So earlier we were talking about that World Health Organization statistic of 15% of people worldwide have a disability. So it doesn't include temporary or situational disabilities, and it also doesn't include a lot of disabilities that are considered less severe, like dyslexia, which affects an estimated 20% of people worldwide. So this is very, very common. And in the study here, a full half of the problems that users encountered were IA problems. They were things like information not being in the page where people expected it to be, unclear content hierarchy, navigation elements not helping users find the things that they were looking for, there being too much information on a page, things that we know about and try to fix all the time. These were blocking issues for a lot of these users. Over and over in the literature, and there's tons of studies about this, we find that IA problems that we already know about, things that we know we should be fixing, become barriers to access. And they become these barriers to access when people bring these diverse contexts to them. So we need to fix this. The good news is that, hey, accessibility is an IA problem. That might not make sense, that might not sound great, but it means that we can help, which I always like. And we need to help because the current tool set isn't getting us all the way there. It's not doing all of the work for us. Most of this is because when we usually talk about accessibility, we talk about adherence to guidelines, or the success criteria as WCAG calls them. And these standards are great. You can all go look them up. They're a great place to start from, but the problem is that they vary quite a bit in the size and complexity of each of the guidelines or success criteria. So, for example, some of them are relatively simple, if expensive to do, like we are supposed to provide captions for all pre-recorded media. If you have a video or some audio on your site, in order to be accessible, you should provide text captions for them also. Okay, that makes sense. We can all do that if we can find the budget for it somewhere. Others are actually really wide-ranging. So another one of them is when the sequence in which content is presented affects its meaning, a correct reading sequence can be programmatically determined. So first of all, I actually have a really hard time thinking of a situation in which the sequence of content has no effect on its meaning. Like that seems like a pretty basic thing that we should all figure out about, consuming language. But getting to consensus on a priority order for items through a page, if you think about doing responsive design and having to stack all of those elements up, that's something that I often do multiple iterations on in the content modeling phase and have very contentious meetings with all kinds of different business stakeholders and other designers about and that kind of thing. This is a process, getting to that optimal order for elements in a page. I understand that the actual requirement of this criterion is narrower. Like, it's really just asking you to put everything in order, so when somebody goes to tab through a page, it just goes. And that's fine. But that in order for this to actually be really helpful, you have to think about the structure of the information, and this has to actually help support that meaning that we're designing for. And we see that difference between just following the letter of the law and its spirit in empirical studies all the time, because it's a difference between technical accessibility and usability. In that same study with dyslexic users, they found that adherence to the WCAG standards was a predictor of how many problems users would find on the site, but not a strong one. Some sites that adhered to the highest standards had more problems than those that didn't adhere to any standard at all. Because adhering to those standards, it helps, but it doesn't do all of the work for you. So they don't do the whole job. There's a lot of variation there. And there are other methods that we can use. I hear people talk about automated tools all the time. There's one called Pally that I believe is open source. Anybody can use. You can hook it up to your dev pipeline. There's another one that we use internally called Kuros, and they check against the criteria. They're great. use them if they make sense for your organization. The problem is, and they will tell you this, like this is not a secret, they only even check against about 30% of those standards because they're the ones you can check for. You can check whether there is alt text. You can check even kind of if the color contrast is high enough. You can't check if the reading order makes sense. That's something we have to do. Sometimes I also hear people say that they don't have to worry about accessibility because they have a web framework that just takes care of that for them. This is not true. I don't care which web framework you work, this is false. A framework can absolutely make it easier or harder to do this work, and your framework absolutely should be accessible, but as Ethan Marcotte points out in his Accessibility is Not a Feature article here, a framework doesn't do accessibility for you any more than it does usability for you. You still have to design a system, you have to design your process, and you have to test it. Lastly, the absolute best advice is to include people with different kinds of access needs in your user research and usability testing. The kind of entry-level recommendation is just seeing if you can include one person per round of testing with some kind of access need. It kind of doesn't really matter what it is. You just want to kind of start getting people in the pipeline. And absolutely, yes, do this. This is great. This is absolutely the best idea. But I think it really works together with unifying the structural ways that we think about sites and content for IA and for accessibility. Interestingly, since I gave this talk for the first time, we did a usability study on docs.microsoft.com with 10 blind or low vision.net developers, which was a real exciting recruiting experience, trying to find those very specific people. And so half of them used a screen reader and half of them used a magnifier. So a lot of times people with low vision will use a magnifier and will enhance text contrast rather than using something like a screen reader. And it was really interesting because it did uncover a few kind of pure technical usability issues that were problems for these people. Things like the focus order not working in the search box the way they expected to, so it was difficult to use, or a node in the table of contents expanding when it shouldn't, and it was weird and kind of freaked people out and that kind of thing. But they were really all annoyances. They were things that, didn't make the site nicer to use, but didn't ruin everything. Every single blocking issue, everything that actually stopped people from being able to complete the tasks we had given them, were IA problems that I already knew about and just hadn't had the organizational will to fix. They were mostly findability issues, or things like not having faceted search that made sense, or our labels not being quite good enough, not making enough sense. I didn't need a whole other study to tell me that we needed to fix those things. It's nice to have the backup, but we could do a lot just by doing the things we already know we need to do. So to get at that unification and to start making information architecture an integral part of your inclusive design process, in addition to including people with access needs in research, because do that. That is good. And there are a lot of resources about how to start doing it. I have 4 challenges for all of us, and I have started doing these too. And my goal with all of these is that they are things that we can do without hiring anyone new or getting additional funding, because that's really hard sometimes. So first, I want you to do the accessibility training that your developers do. If you're in-house, it's easy to find out who your developers are. If you're working with an agency and you work with different developers all the time, there are more general resources you can use. There's a Udacity course here that's pretty good. Accessibility isn't considered recommended training for my role. And so when I went into the training portal for all the different things available to us, it didn't show up. So I had to track down the developers I work with and ask them to send me a link for it. And that's like a whole other issue that nobody thought this was my business. But I really recommend doing the training that your devs do. And this is not because I think designers should code. I don't care if you code or not. That's up to you. I don't want to have that fight. But I think it's really interesting to go through the training that your team is doing, because developers are often asked in this accessibility training to make a lot of the same structural decisions that we do. So we've been talking about this a lot, but things like the priority order of elements on a page. That's one of the things that they're coached to do as part of this accessibility training. And so I want you to go through this training and look for places where they're recreating decisions that you've already made as part of the IA process. And this also means that there are going to be places where you can make their lives easier. Sometimes people get nervous about this kind of thing because they think that they might start making their developers kind of territorial, or they're getting in on somebody else's work. I honestly haven't found that to be the case. Like we've said before, I'm the only information architect in my organization, so nobody really knows what I do or is used to working with somebody like me. And so one of the things I've taken to telling the developers to make them feel better about the whole thing is I'm like, okay, listen, if I do my job right, you never have to decide what goes in a dropdown while you're coding again. I will just do that for you. And they're all like, oh, that sounds great. And so a lot of this accessibility stuff is similar. It's things that they know they have to do, but if somebody else would just make the decision and they could trust them to do a good job at it, they'd be thrilled. It would make their time go so much faster. So don't to put yourself out there and ask for that a little bit. There's some other good resources. One other thing to point your attention to is the new, I think it's new, the Accessibility Developer Guide. It's a collection of best practices developed by the Access for All Foundation in cooperation with 5 different Swiss web and UX agencies. So there's a bunch of stuff in here about how to set up a screen reader so you can use it yourself, which is always kind of a fun experience, and lots of examples and other useful things like that. I think the CEO of Access for All, Sylvia Winkelmann-Ackermann, is...
Yes. If you have any question, please come and ask me. But I just want shortly to mention, it's great. Everything you do for people with disabilities, but the most important message is do it together with them, not only for them. Absolutely.
So I think they're also accepting contributions, or if you want to use it, it seems like a great resource. Okay, so the second thing, or second challenge to do, is to read those WCAG standards that we were talking about. They're the ones that describe the success criteria for meeting different levels of accessibility. Your organization might have a level that you're committing to, but we can do a lot of these things without full organizational buy-in. So go ahead and read them yourself and figure out what makes sense for your org to do. So the training that you did, the first step, it translates those success criteria into what the trainers think developers need to know, which is great, but it's not geared towards information architects. So once you have the context of kind of what your team or a standard team is being asked to deliver, go back and look at the original source. There are huge IA implications to so many of the success criteria, and I want you to start thinking about how you can apply these things in your work. I've also linked a couple of different videos here that you can go back and look at afterwards, and I find them a lot easier to understand than the actual written out criteria. They have examples of these things in action and the kinds of web affordances that each of the success criteria apply to, because it's not always clear exactly what it means. All right, next. Once you've done the training, you have your own notes on what's implicit in those success criteria. Find one thing that you can start adding to whatever artifacts you're already making. If you're doing wireframes, if you're doing page description diagrams, which I highly recommend for this kind of thing, if you're building sitemaps, screen flows, what have you, whatever your artifact already is, when doing the training and in reading success criteria, there's probably one thing you've thought of that you could start adding. We've been talking a lot about that priority order through a page, and solves a lot of problems all at once. But there are other things too. ARIA landmarks, if you're using them. Does anybody know if your team is using ARIA landmarks one way or the other? Ask. They're kind of controversial. Not everybody feels the same way about them, but it's a way of semantically marking up what's going on a page. And it's a good thing for us to know. It's a good question to start asking, whether your team is using them or not. Or something like notes of supplemental labeling for screen readers. Sometimes it's useful to have additional metadata on a page for them, and that's a really good thing to put in a wireframe or something like that. But this is really where that training becomes useful, when you know what your team is being asked to do, because you have an idea of what's likely to be helpful to them instead of just making more work for them. Finally, the smallest, and I think sometimes the scariest, at least for me, thing was to practice saying, this is an accessibility issue. when you're in a meeting or you're in a review. When something is an accessibility issue, it's something you've picked up on. And you might be surprised at the reaction you get. I love my team. I think I have a great job. But very frequently when I raise something as an IA issue, they're all like, we know, Sarah, like, we know, we can't fix this yet. We're just not gonna do it. And I understand, there are lots of competing priorities. Interestingly though, when I raise something as an accessibility issue, that's not what happens. They all kind of stop and they're like, how so? What should we do about it? And so it gets some of these things taken a lot more seriously sometimes. I would try it out on your teams. It doesn't mean that I get my way every single time. That's fine. That's not what I need. But it means that we get to have a conversation about it, which is what I really want out of it. As I've dug into this, I have found that every single IA-related thing that we should do for accessibility would also improve the experience of every single person who uses the site. Prioritizing content, making sure things work logically, establishing intuitive rules. These are all things we should be doing anyway, and things we know about. Once I started thinking about it, it seems really obvious that solid information architecture would be an essential for accessibility, because IA is where you build in both flexibility and trust. I'm the only IA in my organization, so I do a lot of explaining what it is and why it matters. The idea that I frequently come back to is that the UX designers define paths for our users and optimize for completing tasks on me a lot of this tourist bus map. I actually found this for Dublin. I tried to find one for Zurich, but I think you all have too good taste because there aren't these tacky tourist buses everywhere in the same way. So this is still Dublin. And it describes, if you can read it, how the buses would take you from space to space. St. Stephen's Green and St. Patrick's Cathedral, and you hit all the sites in one day. And this reminds me a lot of like a marketing happy path or something. It's going to take you through all of the things that they really think you need to go to in one day. And that's great when that's your goal and you want to sign up for that and you want to pay for it and do all of those, and all the conditions are correct. But that's not what Dublin looks like. That's not what any city looks like. And this is the map of how those buses actually travel. And you don't have to make 6 stops in between the cathedral and the main park in order to see all those things. You can walk in between them. So those paths only work in very specific circumstances when everybody wants them to work. In the real world and in most digital experiences, people can move in lots of different ways. They can do lots of different things. And as soon as we start thinking about diverse access needs, those different ways multiply. I really feel like it's my job as an information architect to stitch all of these different paths together into a world that makes sense. So people can do things that I never anticipated on this site. Because if I had to guess every single way somebody is going to use this website, it would be terrible. Like I would never be able to do that. And that's especially true when we start thinking about different kinds of access needs. But it's also true for just everybody. When people depart from these standard paths because either they want to or they need to, we need to make sure that everything still works. So technical accessibility is absolutely essential. Like, let's make sure we check those boxes. Let's have alt text. Let's make sure our color contrast is there. Do all of those things. But so much of what makes sites really usable and intelligible and helpful across access needs is good information architecture. If we merge those implicit requirements and accessibility standards with the IA that we already know we should be doing, we'll be better at our jobs because we'll be building worlds that really do include everyone. Thank you. So the whole deck is up there at that link, and all the resources and studies and things mentioned there. What questions do we have? I think we have a few minutes, right? Nobody's going to ask that nobody will pay for this? Yeah.
Thanks. So I find it really interesting to include users with special needs in testing. challenge we faced with that was that recruitment agencies often just don't support this. Did you face the same issue, and how did you come across this? So how did you actually get those users?
Yeah, so there are specialty recruitment agencies that will get you like specifically to users with access needs if that's the thing that you need. Otherwise, I don't know the exact issues that you've run into. We ran into the issue that we didn't actually know if we had anybody who had an access need. Like we probably didn't have anybody who was using a screen reader, but I didn't know if we had anybody who was dyslexic or anybody who routinely used a magnifier or something like that. And so adding it to the screener just to ask was the first step for us. Depending on where you are, there could be different regulations about whether you're allowed to ask those questions, that kind of thing. I don't know. But I would say the first step is asking. The gov.uk resource that I link to in there, they have a bunch of really good kind of basic information about going from 0, we have never talked to anybody that has an access need as far as we know, to including them more regularly. So they're doing a pretty good job. And I think they have a lot of funding and recruitment issues also. It's in the deck, yeah.
Hi, thanks for your talk. What is your favorite product or website that you hold as a beacon of good information architecture accessibility?
Oh God. That's a good question. Okay, so I think the hard thing in here is that I don't know how a lot of these things actually test. I know how my site tests, and my site is ugly and terrible in many ways. I mean, I love it because it's mine, but like, it's just awful in so many ways. And we actually get dinged all the time for not following the letter of the law for some of these accessibility things, but it's based on testing with actual users, and it works. And a lot of developers with access needs just love the way it works, even though the expert reviews are like, no, you can't do that. And we're like, but they love it. Like, it really works. We designed it with people who need this. So it's really hard to know just from me looking at something whether something else works. Off the top of my head, I would say that I think, again, the gov.uk people have done a really good job, and the BBC also, I would guess. Just from me looking at it, I also think that they deal with information architecture problems that are familiar to me, because they're these like huge rambling different sites with different kinds of navigation and that kind of thing. They're probably much better options if you're solving different kinds of problems. Like you need something that's very intensively interactive or something like that. Also, to be obnoxiously self-promoting, I do think that this is something that Microsoft handles pretty well in general. My site is not the greatest at it, but Microsoft is huge, and all the different websites are very different. So the official Microsoft design language standards and that kind of thing do a very good job, and they actually have a very lovely little training course on inclusive design and how you can start doing that in your organization. They have a toolkit you can download.
Where would I be able to find that?
I think it's microsoft.com/design. And they're kind of really leaning into inclusive design as the way we do design. Like, there is no design and then accessibility, it's just design. And this is what we do first. So I think it's just there.
Thank you very much, Sarah.
No problem.
We do have time for one more question.
There's somebody in the back.
Thank you. I have a perhaps it's a weird question. So I'm working in the project business, not in the product business, which will be Microsoft. And we always have problems to try to solve the customer, the UX part.
Okay.
So the problem, so how will you do that to try to also sell the accessibility and to the whole thing? Because the problem normally is that the budget is fixed, the scope is fixed with just technical stuff or perhaps things that they need, so features. But accessibility is never really a question. The customer comes forward with that, and I just had now the question: how could I sell one of my customers that actually are in the industry, and they're quite waterfall thinking, these kind of things.
Yeah, I would say that generally speaking, I have found that coding for accessibility makes things take a little bit longer and it's more work because they actually have to do different kinds of things. If we're doing UX and IA correctly, you've done your job. Like you've mostly made things accessible. You know, probably 80%, not 100%. It could be better, but that's kind of where we're going to get most of the time. We don't want to let perfect be the enemy of good. So I find it harder. It's harder to get into development budgets than it is to get into design budgets because we can just kind of do it anyway. In terms of making the case for actually getting people to pay for it, I think really either the regulatory or the lawsuit argument is the only good one because those are expensive if you mess those up. So generally speaking, when you're talking to business people, you have to go the lawsuit route. So I would pull those statistics for your country and see how big of a problem it is, or if there were any kind of high profile articles about people being embarrassed by this kind of thing. It's a little bit more of a stick, not a carrot.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Thank you, Sarah.